go to if you needed to solve like a problem of world hunger? The political scientist or historian?
Historian.
Non-historians don't answer. Okay. Traditionally, history has been seen as a kind of less useful social science. That's in a place like Australia, where I'm from, and Natalie is too, even though her accent's beginning to change, slowly but surely. In Australia, history is seen as a social science, not a humanities. Although I think probably even here, it's on the kind of harder edge of humanities. So it's not like literary criticism, for example. I always target literary criticism. I must have some deep-seated antipathy towards literary critics. But history can actually be very useful. And I'm going to talk about how historians can be useful, particularly in the case of fragile states. I said in the abstract that a fragile state is a state that can't withstand sudden changes, like a natural disaster, or a coup, or an invasion, or attempts to implement basic infrastructure, like roads or healthcare, or implement a democratic system of governance, or anything like that. They don't do very well with those kind of changes being implemented. And so they become very vulnerable to collapse at the slightest provocation. Their opposites are stable states, and we would say that Western Europe is made up of mostly stable states. Australia is a stable state. I used to think the same about America, but just I've seen I've only got here 3.5 years ago, and already I've seen your political system kind of implode upon itself. So I'm not sure that we would call the United States exactly a stable state anymore, particularly because one of the hallmarks of being a fragile state is the inability or the lack of will to implement basic services to all its citizens. And that's something I'm seeing increasingly in the United States as not being something that's considered important. Okay, so fragile and stable states are most often considered to be the business of political scientists and development agencies, but historians can play a valuable role in building the capacity of fragile states. Namely by elucidating how states came to be precarious in the first place and how they can safeguard their weaknesses for the future. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about a couple of different situations in which historians either could, are, or can, if they wish, to make a difference in considering fragile states across the globe. So I'm going to talk first of all about what fragile states are. And there are a number of different definitions. The one I've put up here is fragility is defined as describing a country that is failing or at high risk of failing in 3 dimensions. Firstly, in terms of authority, the state doesn't have the authority to protect its citizens from violence, either an invasion from without or from dissension within, civil war, that kind of thing. Secondly, service failures. The state fails to ensure that all citizens have access to basic services. And thirdly, legitimacy failures. The state lacks legitimacy, enjoys only limited support among the people, and is typically not democratic. Other definitions are sort of from either development or political science. So a development one would be a stable and effective state is a precondition for human development and human security, and a state which fails to provide development and security to its citizens is neither strong nor stable, it is fragile. That would be a kind of development one from Scandinavia, because they're all about human security. And then we have a more political science-oriented one. While there is no internationally agreed definition of the term fragile states or fragility, most development agencies define it principally as a fundamental failure of the state to perform functions necessary to meet citizens' basic needs and expectations, with the emphasis being on only a citizen has a right to expect a state to provide services because they're working from a Westphalian model of sovereignty. Okay, there are critiques of using the term fragile states. People have started to say, well, it's very much bound up in normative ideas of what a state is, and so development agencies are now increasingly favouring the broader terminology of fragility or situations of fragility. And these terms also seem to better capture the fact that fragility is not exclusively determined by the nature and boundaries of states. There is a need to look beyond the state to the state of society in addressing and redressing fragility. Okay, what are the causes of fragile states? What makes them fragile? Well, you can have social and structural and economic factors, so things like poverty, low income, economic decline, violent conflict, the presence of armed insurgents, natural resource wealth or a lack of natural resource wealth, geography, so having bad neighbours, and demographic stress, including urbanisation. before infrastructure is really developed. So if you suddenly have a gold rush, so gold is discovered, and suddenly where there used to be a village of 300 people, there's 30,000 in the space of a month. There has been no time to lay the pipes to cart waste away, for example. So you end up with a situation where everyone's basically pooping in the street, and that leads to very poor sanitation and disease. And of course, there aren't enough doctors or hospitals to cope with a sudden influx of diseased persons, so people die, so there's a huge mortality, etc., etc. Then we have political and institutional factors. Crises of state legitimacy and authority, bad governance, repression of political competition, weak institutions, hybrid political orders, institutional multiplicity. So, for example, in the north of Iraq, where my mother was working, there's a situation where there's a large group of people who are Kurdish, okay, and they traditionally have lived in Anatolia, so between Turkey and Iraq, and they want their own autonomous state. And Iraq has always denied them very much autonomy under Saddam Hussein and afterwards. And so in the north, in Kurdistan, as the Kurds call it, and northern Iraq, as the Iraqis call it, there are two rival ministries of health across the street from each other. One is run by Kurds, and the other is run by the Iraqi state. So with these two ministries, they're doing basically the same kind of programs for the same people, but they're basically doing it twice, and the limited amount of resources for health programs is being split between two rival organizations. So in that sense, it's very bad for the people in the area, because if they pooled the resources and worked together, it would obviously be better for everybody. There are political transitions, and in political transitions, the ousted people are always determined to leave the most damage possible as they're ousted from their position. There's succession and reform crises in authoritarian states. So when one very strong ruler, like Marcos, for example, in the Philippines, when he had to step down because basically his entire family were running the Philippines, it left really big vacuums for leadership. And so some people who stepped in were very able and meritorious, and others who stepped in were not, but they were in the right place at the right time. So this then leads to other problems. And then we have things like state predation. So the state can swoop in and demarcate a natural resource as being the property of the state instead of the people that have traditionally lived there. And neo-patrimonial policies. Then we have social factors. So inequalities, identity fragmentation, social exclusion, gender inequality, a lack of social cohesion, including a lack of social capital. And in Cambodia, we can see this after 1979, because most of the people who had had some education were killed or targeted for killing during the Khmer Rouge regime. And so when the state was trying to reconstruct itself from 1979 onward, there was a lack of social capital, because they simply didn't have people with any kind of educational training who could contribute to the reconstruction of the state. And then a weak civil society. In order to have a civil society, you normally need people in the middle class, because they normally have enough income and spare time to devote to humanitarian causes, for example. Okay? So if you are a peasant and all you do is agricultural work 7 days a week, year in, year out, you don't usually have very much spare time, and if you do, you're not going to spend it trekking into town to go to, say, a meeting of how to help unwed mothers in the village. You've got to go to sleep because you have to get up the next morning and go to work again. Then there are international factors. So legacies of colonialism, for example, international political economy, climate change, global economic shocks, including food prices. And we saw this during the Great Depression. So in the colonies, where some people who had been colonized were finally able to sort of make a dent and become merchants and were profiting from the colonial global economy. With the World Depression, the global depression of the 1930s, suddenly the bottom fell out of markets for rice, for rubber, for tin. Michelin was not making cars anymore, so they didn't need rubber to make tires, so all of the rubber plantations in French Indochina, suddenly no one was buying their rubber, so the workers weren't getting paid. But the workers had all been moved from subsistence agriculture a couple of generations ago, so suddenly they had no way to feed their families. I know when we think of the Depression, we normally think about images from North America, or in my case Australia, where people basically just wandered around for years at a time because there was no work and there was no way to get any. But in the colonies, it was worse because the colonies were already oppressed and economically impoverished. And so the global economic depression had a worse effect on enterprises there. Okay, so this is a map showing the State Fragility Index in 2007. So it's most high in Africa, as you can see. It's extreme in the center of Africa, in Burma, and in parts of the Middle East. Okay. But it's still pretty bad throughout most of the world. I mean, it's not ideal. We want to see big white spaces, and really the only big white spaces we see are Australia, woohoo, we're number one, the US and Canada, and in some parts of South America and Western Europe. But that's, like a third of the world only, right, is not fragile. The rest of the world is fragile. So we all have an interest in doing something about it. This is where I come to how historians can make a difference. Okay, we can do it in two ways. There are two ways we can do this in. We can, first of all, is kind of a development kind of way. So in what I call a policy or advocacy context. So we can use history. We can use the fact that we are trained to investigate the past to show that traditionally a group that is oppressed today was not always in that situation and how that actually came to pass. Okay, so I'm going to use two examples here. First of all, there's a very, very famous book by James C. Scott called The Art of Not Being Governed. And I recommend anyone who's interested in political science, ethnic minorities, or history, or sovereignty even, should read it. It's one of the classics of our time. This is what he calls Zomia. So this whole area here is called Zomia. So it transcends the boundaries of what we would call East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, okay, and Central Asia as well. So he's not abiding by traditional concepts that we have imposed on maps in hard lines. This is basically the massif, the kind of the mountain structure that runs from essentially the central highlands of Vietnam down here, westward all the way to northeastern India and including the southwest Chinese provinces of Yunnan, Guizhou, and western Guangxi. Zomia has been peopled over the last 2,000 years largely by runaways, he says, from state-making projects in the valleys.